Uh, Hey guys, and welcome to today's video. So I've got a very interesting guest. I've got with me Lamont from the Days of French and Swedish. So hello Lamont, how are you?
Hey, good, thanks, man. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. So I'm very excited to get the chance to talk to him. I first saw his interview with Ollie a few weeks ago and then started watching a few of his other videos. He's got a very interesting take on language learning and just, immersion-based learning in general. So very excited to get the chance to speak to him. So do you want to give a brief introduction to yourself and your channel in case anyone's not heard of you?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Lamont. As Luke said, I live in Australia. I haven't left Australia since 2001. I haven't had the chance to go anywhere else. 2002, sorry, I went to Germany. But yeah, I started learning Swedish about 4 years ago, and then about a year later, I thought I was pretty good at Swedish. I wasn't actually, but I started learning French as well, and I sort of kept that up for 2 years, kind of learning both at the same time, just doing various things. I didn't really have a strict approach to it, but and then maybe 8 months ago now, I've put French on hold indefinitely to focus on Swedish full time, because I'm trying to actually bring up my younger son, who's now 7 months old, in Swedish. So I speak to him in Swedish all the time. I don't always know what I'm saying necessarily, but that's where I'm at.
Interesting. I'm just going to make a note of that because that's something I want to talk about later. Then raising or trying to raise a child in another language seems like an interesting topic. So I guess Swedish is quite a strange choice, or at least less common choice for Westerners, people in the English sphere, to learn as a second language. So French, I guess, is, at least in the UK, it's very common. I know in Canada it's very common as well. America, probably one of the more common ones as well. But Swedish not so much. So I'm kind of curious what first got you into that.
Yeah, well, it's kind of really hard to understand for someone who doesn't know how I generally get into things, which is that something like this has been the story through all the things I've been obsessed with. I've been obsessed with some really strange things that seem completely removed from languages and stuff, and they are completely removed. But it's always one thing will be happening, and that has no particular effect on its own, and then something else will happen, and I'll start thinking about that idea, and then a third thing will happen that will throw me over the edge, kind of thing. And so I guess the one thing you would say was that it was around sort of later in the era of Scandi Noir. So we were watching season 3 of The Bridge, which, if you don't know, is a very popular Swedish-Danish series. So that's, and my wife and I had also watched The Killing, which is a Danish one that runs for about 600 episodes or some ridiculous. It's just massive.
600, wow.
And yeah,
each 40 minutes long.
It's 40 episodes, but season 1 is 20 episodes, and each is 55 minutes long. So it's an epic season 1. And you could probably learn Danish from that just by turning the subtitles off. And yeah, so I watched a lot of kind of Scandinavian stuff. I was starting to learn what was where in those countries a little bit. I didn't before that. I could have just told you they're in Europe. And then a Finnish woman stayed with us, and she was a friend of my wife's, and she basically invited us to Finland at the end of her stay. And I thought, well, if we're going to go to Finland, it won't be soon. It'll be in quite a while. So I'll start learning a Scandinavian language. And I picked Swedish. I think it was actually, I'd like to say that I did some research and picked Swedish because it was the most commonly spoken, which it is. But I think it was actually that my theory was that I know a tiny, tiny little bit of German. And if Denmark falls geographically between Germany and Sweden, then maybe it falls linguistically between those two as well. And amazingly, that is kind of true. If you speak,
so you thought that would be like path of least resistance almost, so it would be the best one to go for.
Yeah, I thought that might give me an understanding of Danish as well, because I did know that like they were similar enough that sometimes those two people can understand each other, although that really varies depending on a lot of things. So that's the one I went for, but that turned out to be a good choice in that I didn't know it had like twice the number of native speakers as Danish does, and
Oh, wow.
Finnish and Norwegian. Had I have done it again, I might have gone for Norwegian, because that really is like the middle of the three. So Norwegians are the best at understanding the other two. But yeah, Swedish is what I went for. And I guess you could say the third thing, if I've missed one of the things, was that I didn't really take it seriously at first, because I was just like, yeah, I'm sure that, like, this is not going to happen for real. But it was that I got a little bit okay at it, and then I asked the Finnish friend on Facebook like how her Swedish was, because I knew she'd studied it in school. So I was like, yeah, I'm getting like okay at this. How good is your Swedish? And I was just joking, but she was like, well, it's better than yours. And she was completely right, for sure. But then that I just thought it'd be funny to get like really good at it. I don't know why. Maybe I'm spite or something, but I was like, I didn't dislike her saying that at all. I thought it was really funny and true, but I just thought it'd be really funny to turn up in Finland, like, even though most Finnish people don't speak Swedish well, I just thought it'd be funny to turn up one day speaking like perfect Swedish kind of thing. And then at some point it just became like all I did with all my free time was just Swedish all the time kind of thing.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah,
I can definitely relate a little bit that it just starts off with kind of like a little thing that I'm messing around on. Well, one of the Cantonese didn't have Duolingo, but like some app, they had like the pinyin on with like all the different numbers for the tones, and I didn't even know what the numbers meant. I was just ignoring them. I was just kind of, whatever. I'll just learn a little bit, and then somehow a few months later, I started to become quite obsessed, and I'm not exactly sure how it happened or why it happened, but you just kind of
totally
fall down the hole.
Yeah, when I was watching you talking to Matt, I was like, this guy's so similar to me. Like, that you don't really remember what happened in between those two things. You just remember starting it, and then at some point you just like that's all you were doing. Yeah.
Cool. So that's really interesting. So how good would you say your Swedish is now? You've been learning for is it a few years? Is it?
Well, yeah.
I think. Okay.
Technically, it's 4 years, and I've kind of got to own that, in that it's like it has definitely been 4 years from start to finish, but I do kind of give myself a bit of an excuse in that like a good 18 months of that was spent immersing in French quite heavily. So my French reading and listening, not that I do it actively anymore, but sometimes I need to, like sometimes people write on my channel in French. So like I can still do it. So it's okay. So there was a good amount of time that I wasn't really focused on Swedish at all. Although I do think that some things get better even by not, like even when you're not exposed to it at all, some things just sort of seem to fall into place in your brain.
That's actually quite interesting, because we can probably talk about that a bit more later. But yeah,
sure. So as to how good my Swedish is, I mean, you know how tough that is to answer, but like, I can, in short conversations, in which there's like a lack of context, which is quite a lot of them with a Swede, they will generally assume that I'm either Swedish or maybe have Swedish parents or something, and that's maybe not because my Swedish is perfect so much as like the last thing they would assume is that I've learned Swedish. That's like not a thing that exists in their world unless someone obviously migrates to Sweden. So yeah, there was like, for example, there was an air conditioning guy at our house a couple of weeks ago, and he heard me talking to my son in Swedish, and he was like, that would be a pretty weird thing to do if you weren't Swedish. So he was just like, no way, are you Swedish? Like, I didn't even know that. Like, and then I had to explain, well, actually, I'm not Swedish. I've just learned Swedish. And then like, that was an even weirder conversation when he was like, okay.
So why are you talking to your son in Swedish? And it's like,
But yeah, so it like when I'm kind of on good form, as you might put it, like when the words are coming together nicely, I can go like quite a few sentences before I say something that doesn't sound right to a native speaker. Mm-hmm. And normally, even in that case, I know I say something and I'm like, nah, that wasn't right. Or that sounded weird, or the way I pronounced that word was strange or something. But they've got a lot of different accents too, so sometimes they just assume you're from some like random northern thing. Yeah,
that's quite interesting. Because when I was in the UK before, I ran into some. I was taking the tram to somewhere, and I overheard some Hong Kongers speaking Cantonese behind me, like asking, like, "Oh, did they know where the train station is or something?" So I turned around and was like, "Oh, I think it's that way." But they'd obviously never seen a white guy in England just turn around and speak Cantonese before, and they were just like, "Oh, well, you must be like kind of like half like mixed race or something. Or you must be like half and half." And obviously, my Cantonese sounds nothing like a native or anything, but it's just the fact that no one really learns it. So it's like, well, that must be the closest thing to a logical explanation for what's going on.
Yeah, totally. And you have this whole other aspect to kind of contend with, I guess, which is that can't like. Asian people have a certain look that is not like you. Like, and Matt's talked about that as well, like where he'll say like, "Oh, where'd you get that bag?" or something, and she's like, and this girl's like, "What? Were you raised in Japan? Like, what's kind of?" Whereas I don't really have to contend with that, and it's funny. Like, I've never ever in my whole life been told that I looked Scandinavian until people heard that I speak Swedish, like whether it's Australian people or Swedish people, and then suddenly they're like, "Oh yeah, well you look Swedish," and it's like, I think you've just put that on me because now you think it makes sense. Like,
yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So anyway, going back to a thing you said a second ago, because I thought that was quite interesting. You said that even though you've left French alone, like when you come back to it, you think some things have kind of got better or consolidated, maybe, and some things have improved. I know there's an e-course I think called Learning How to Learn by Barbara Oakley. He talks about like if you're relaxed and not thinking about something, it's still kind of making connections in the back of your brain and kind of like reconsolidating, which is why rest and breaks and sleep and walking and all stuff like that's like quite a big part of learning, as opposed to just banging your head against the wall. So I'm wondering what your experience was with that. So you went, I think 7 or 8 months now, you said you've been going kind of hard with just Swedish and dropping the French.
Yeah.
And then when you go back to it, you've noticed it hasn't fallen by that much, or some areas even improved, or what?
I might have implied that, but I was actually trying to say the other way around, which was that I felt like my certain things in Swedish got better even in the time that I was focusing on French.
Right, okay. Sorry.
But so I mean, it could have happened in French as well, but I wouldn't really know because I haven't kind of tried to test it or anything. I mean, obviously, like you can't just not do anything for like months at a time and expect to get better. Mm-hmm. But I do think certain things consolidate better. And with Swedish, I would say it was definitely a pronunciation thing, because the pronunciation is not heaps easy for an English speaker, and like it's probably the hardest aspect of Swedish, which is obviously a relatively easy language for an English speaker, but it's really quite hard to nail down. And you can pick most foreigners. Like it's very rare that you hear a non-native Swedish speaker who sounds anything like a Swede. And I found that when I went back to it after like a couple of months of focusing on French, at first it was like really rusty, and then one day certain things I'd like say a vowel and go like, "Oh, that was a lot closer than I used to get it."
Do you think that potentially the break from learning could mean, because I think a lot of something that people have to contend with, and it's a problem that I have with Mandarin, is I have a lot of like bad habits when speaking, from things like muscle memory, and you say something and I know it's wrong and then you correct yourself or try to, but when you're not thinking, it's just so ingrained in like your muscle memory or like your habits that you just can't not say it that way. So I wonder if by not speaking for a few months or focusing on French for a few months, when you come back to it, because I've noticed that with other things like sports as well. When I've been playing table tennis, I used to hold the bat in a way that was probably not correct, or it was too tense in my wrist or something. Don't play for a few months and come back, and then it's actually easier to change the old habit because I'm not used to playing as much. So I wonder if that's got anything to do with it. Oh,
for sure. Like that could well be a part of it. I think another part of it is when, like, I haven't dived deep into the into Krashen's kind of research, but I know that he, because of the idea that it's actually subconscious, it's mostly a subconscious process. There's something, it comes into it like how much you're actually enjoying it, and I think almost by definition, like, learning can definitely be enjoyable, but when you're trying to learn something, you're taking away a certain element of its enjoyment. And so by even giving yourself a break, it's almost like giving your brain the day off on that language actually helps it to go like, well, now it's just like this enjoyable thing that exists in here, and it might be able to sort some things out. So I had a recent experience in Swedish where, like, I was trying to get this series that is only available in the Nordic countries at the moment, and I was like doing all this stuff with like accounts from those countries and stuff, and like they were like quite stringent about it. And eventually I got around their system and managed to pay them money to let me watch this Swedish series. And it was so like I wasn't interested in the Swedish. I wanted to watch the series. That's what I was actually wanting to watch it for. And I watched the whole thing. And then like a day later I had a lesson and I felt like my Swedish just was at a totally different level to where it had been before. And I couldn't really work it out until I reread that thing about like enjoying the language, and I was like, oh, I've finally stopped trying to learn the language all the time, and I'm just enjoying it, and it seems to hit a new stride when you do that.
Because I think I'm not delved into his research, but I've watched some of his interviews, and the word that he loves to use is compelling, that it's so interesting that you just kind of get lost and forget that it's in another language. And I've had similar experiences when I'll just go to watch a TV show, and normally I'd be say like, oh well, if I'm working, I'd try to watch like 1 or 2 episodes a day or something, because you got to fit it around your like whatever other stuff like family, friends, and work and stuff. But then, I think it was sometimes on the weekend, you just pick up a TV series and then you just get addicted to it, and then spend like the whole day just watching something in Mandarin. And before I know it, I was like, oh well, that's over, and then go to the class the next day, and the teacher's just like, well, you're speaking really good today. I'm like, am I? Oh, cool. Yeah. I spent all of yesterday watching TV. But.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I kind of wish I'd done it sooner, because even when I'm immersing in stuff that I enjoy, I'm always still trying to like get stuff out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's something that I find really hard as well, because I always kind of think there's some benefit in both. You want to just kind of turn your brain off and let it soak over you, but also you want to kind of spend sometimes analysing it. So for example, with the tones in Mandarin, when I'm watching TV, a lot of the time there's always like a little part of my brain who's trying to like pick out what the tones are and making sure I can follow along with stuff. And I almost think that like sometimes, because I have see a character and I think I know what the tone is, I almost kind of like think about it too much and put on what I'm listening to, what I think it is, as opposed to like, just listening to it and relaxing. So I almost feel sometimes like the overanalyzing and the kind of conscious knowledge can interfere a little bit, but then if you literally just relaxed and just enjoyed yourself, you probably pick it up more naturally sometimes.
Yeah, well, I think so you would after a point. Well. Yeah, I think you would after a point, but there is that this is kind of what I call the paradox of language learning, which is like okay, so if we know that comprehensible input is what works and does the bulk of the work in our learning, that's great. But then how do we make non-comprehensible input comprehensible? Mm-hmm. So, yeah,
when you start, you understand nothing. So.
Yeah, exactly. So, so I think that may work after a very short time of like focused study in French, but it certainly wouldn't be as fast as like doing like a reasonable amount of focused study in Anki or something and then just immersing. But I do think it would work in French or Spanish or German or something in the end.
So I guess that'll be a good segue into something else I wanted to talk about, which was trying to get into immersion-based learning as a beginner, when you don't understand very much. So to kind of throw the question back at you, what you just said, how do you make incomprehensible input comprehensible? And what have you used in the past, apart from just suck it up and listen? Because that's something you hear a lot, and it doesn't seem very useful advice a lot of the time.
Yeah, I kind of feel a bit lucky in this regard. I mean, one, in that, like, I've studied some pretty easy languages, but also...
I think Swedish is quite hard compared to a lot of the other European ones.
I think Swedish is harder than it has a reputation of being. I think non-language learners, like people who don't know anything about languages at all, just assume that it's hard because it's like it sounds obscure, so they think obscure must mean hard, right? But that's not. Those two things are unrelated. But people in the language learning world have probably seen some like dumbed down video that says like, oh, these are the easiest languages, and Swedish should be somewhere in the top 10 easiest languages for English speakers. So people go like, oh, it's easy. Like that sort of, it's definitely easy to a low level because it has like relatively simple grammar. It doesn't have verb conjugations. But at a higher level, it becomes harder because they often don't form their sentences in anywhere near the same way as English speakers do. So like you could say that, but they never would say that. And things mean different things to what they sound like they mean. And then there's the pronunciation aspect, which again, like my pronunciation is pretty good, but it's far from perfect. And then there's very few non-native speakers who sound like natives. So yeah, like technically it's easy, but I think in reality it's a bit harder than people think. But as to answer your question, I was reasonably lucky in that I didn't know what I was doing, and so I didn't like stick to any I didn't stick to any advice that turned out like not to work. Like I did like a little bit of stuff that now I just go, oh, okay, that was a waste of time. But mostly I did stuff that I thought was actually not that helpful that turned out to be really helpful. So things like ridiculous amounts of repetitive listening to the Pod 101 dialogues.
Oh, yeah. I did that.
Yeah, so like I heard that, I didn't even know that Ollie recommended this, but I heard you say that Ollie recommended it. Just, okay, forget about the track where they speak heaps of English and just listen to the dialogues over and over again. I kind of did that. Like once I listened to that whole big track that has the English in it once, which I do think is useful actually because they go into a lot of culture and stuff there, which so it's useful to hear once. But then I had a job where I worked. I had a job where I worked. That's a good statement. I had a job where I worked in different places, so I had to drive around a lot, and I just had it like on repeat in the car for who knows how long. And I did the same with this like one random audiobook that I could find. I have no idea why it was that audiobook and not another one, because Swedes record everything in audio. So like if there's a book of it, there's a Swedish audiobook of it.
Oh wow, that's really useful.
Yeah, it's very cool. But anyway, I had that just on repeat, and I remember just having like, I've got no idea what's happening here, like none at all. And then later, like having heard it like a fourth or fifth time, going like, they're in a police station, and then now I know that they're actually in a hospital or something. So, but like all that repetitive listening that I thought, like, I'm like, well, I'm not going anywhere far enough to bother putting on music or something that I'd actually like to listen to. I thought it wasn't doing anything. It was just like in my head. But, you know, a year later, 2 years later or whatever, and especially now that I can just read that book completely like it's English kind of thing, I'm like, I don't remember where I learned any of these words, but I know all of them. Like,
you mean read the text version of the audiobook you listen to?
Yeah, or like either, you know.
And when you read it, do you ever hear like the voice in your head still of like the woman or the man talking or narrating it?
If I were to read that book, definitely. Yeah, like especially because it was actually just the first 8 chapters, like over and over again. Because I just had a car with a CD player, like no Bluetooth or anything, so it was just the same, just 8 chapters on that CD. But yeah, so it's like I learned so much stuff, so much sentence structure and so much vocabulary, like passively, without even knowing that I was learning it. And just I genuinely thought that listening did nothing at all for my Swedish, but it turned out to probably be doing the most of anything else I was doing. So to answer your question, like repetitive listening, obviously it depends like how far removed the language is from your own. But something like I think you would just like listen to the Pod 101 dialogues until you could understand them completely, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it was basically when I was so I didn't use Pod 101 for Mandarin, but I used it for the equivalent, which is Cantonese Class 101 when I was learning Cantonese, but when I was Googling how to learn, the thing that came up more than anything else was Cantonese Class 101, and then I used it for a little bit and didn't really make any progress. I then saw a blog post by Ollie. I think it said something like how to use Cantonese Class 101 to actually learn Cantonese, and I was like, oh, well, I've already bought this, I might as well give it a read because it was free.
Yeah.
And he laid out the fact that, you know, most people go onto the website, listen to the English podcast, and then listen to the dialogue itself once or maybe twice, and then be like, right, I've listened to the podcast, they've explained it, and now I listen to that and I know what it is, and then they kind of move on to the next thing. And that's kind of what I did. And then I found that nothing stuck in my brain at all, and everything, you know, just kind of fell out because I've only heard most of the words like once or twice and spaced out by maybe a quarter an hour.
Yeah.
And then I found his approach when he kind of tackles it in terms of, you know, I think he has a post called something like Attacking Language Dialogues, and that was found really, really useful in the way that it just kind of gave a very systematic approach to say, okay, well, you've got audio, listen to it. Can you understand it? So you listen to it a few times, see what you can understand. Then add the text after, listen and read a few times. You can probably understand more, but not 100%. Go through slowly and look up the words you don't know to kind of fill in the vocabulary gaps. And then when you go back to listen and read, you should be able to understand 100%. Then take the text and the word list and everything away and listen again. And whatever you should be able to understand a lot more than before, but obviously some words you'll forget. Then the ones you forget, just look back at the transcript again to kind of remind you of what they are. And then, you know, taking a reasonable sized dialogue over the course of an hour. And I did this with Pod 101 beginning, but then later I did it with YouTube videos and stuff. You spend like an hour on something that goes from mostly incomprehensible to, by the end of an hour, having it completely comprehensible. And one of the reasons why when I was doing Spanish and a bit of Mandarin at the start, I used the Link app a lot because I dissected the dialogues on Link. But then after, all the audio is on my phone, so I can use it really easily for passive listening. So I'll dissect it in the morning. And then when I was walking around anywhere or, you know, just doing the dishes or something, I'd have this big playlist of YouTube videos that I've already kind of went over and just kind of have them on loop and just, you know, randomize the order. And that kind of having that in the background the whole time was, you know, at the fairly early stage of mostly comprehensible input that's repetitive, I thought was quite useful.
Yeah. Yeah. And another thing you can do is like listen to something that you have already listened to before, or it's that you already know. So like the Harry Potter books are a famous example. Like a lot of people have read them in their native language. So you can normally get the book and normally the audio book as well but it doesn't have to be Harry Potter, just whatever, something it doesn't really matter how vaguely you know the story. If you like just those few kind of bits that you're like, oh yeah, I remember they do this. And that's kind of a way of almost like hacking into into it some kind of comprehensible input, because you're cheating part of the comprehension in that you know it already. But
and also with like TV shows, I think when I first started, I didn't really know what I was doing. I just for a bit of fun, I started watching some Hong Kong dramas with like English subtitles.
Yeah.
And then about 3 or 4 months in, I had, maybe like about 9-10 shows that I'd seen by that point, all with English subs that I kind of knew the plot for. And when I wanted to kind of start getting into watching stuff without subtitles, I just rewatched the same shows because I already knew what was going on. I'd already watched it with subtitles once, so I kind of felt like, oh, I don't really... And I think that the main benefit is it kind of, if you know the plot already, it makes it more engaging at a lower level of comprehension. So even if I don't know what they're talking about in a lot of scenes, you can still kind of follow the plot because you know what's happening, and that kind of makes the watching a lot more enjoyable.
It makes it enjoyable. But like, I think the assumption of many like new learners is that if you don't have subtitles on, then, and you can't understand very much, then your brain will just like take the easy option of not trying to decode anything and doing no work. But I think your subconscious brain is like actually a lot more studious than we give it credit for. Like, and it's actually always trying to decode whatever it's hearing. So it's actually just the subtitles that give us the comfort of not. You know what I'm trying to say? It's just the subtitles that mean our brain can switch off and just read the English. But like, you will see if you see an error in the English subtitles, as in a misspelled word or something, you'll spot it, which shows how carefully you do actually listen, or how carefully you do actually take in what's on the screen. So when you
I think that depends on your level though, right? So if you're a beginner, you probably wouldn't pay any attention, but if like you did that with Swedish now, you'd probably start comparing the two, I'm guessing. Oh yeah, like no, so I mean like if you're like a non-learner and you've got the English subtitles on, like just because you're watching, like I grew up watching stuff with subtitles, it was kind of normal to me. But if there's like a spelling error in the English, you'll see it and be like, oh, that was wrong, right? All right, yeah. Which shows how carefully you do actually take stuff in. And so it's really just that leap of faith to turn the subtitles off that makes you go like, I actually can hear little parts of this. Like even if it's, I remember when I did it for one of my favorite movies, which is a French movie. Like this is way 10 years before I was into language learning. And I remember turning it off and just being like, I'm just going to watch it like for the visuals of the movie, but actually ended up like listening quite a lot and going like, oh, that word is kind of similar and stuff. And it's like, now that just seems super obvious to me. It's like, of course it's a super similar language, but like what I'm saying is like your conscious takes the easy route, but your subconscious will keep doing work no matter what, I think. I mean, even with like examples of languages that are quite distant, you can still notice patterns. So like, like when I used to went through a phase when I was at university when I watched quite a lot of anime and stuff like that. And, I tried once just watching it without because I was curious. And, you notice that like every time they eat, they go, itadakimasu. And like, it's just something that you can, even though I don't really understand most of what they were saying, or when Steve and Matt did a interview together in Japanese, I watched the whole thing even though I didn't understand it. Yeah, so then I think that's because I think there are actually subtitles now, but maybe they weren't when they first went up or something. When I watched it. Yeah, but I think what is quite fascinating about that to me is just seeing like Steve like suggests that they switch to Japanese, and Matt says like one little thing and then like takes like a little while to kind of start warming up, and then Steve says something else, and then Matt just goes like and like just goes into this like next level Japanese, and that's what's really interesting to hear. I remember just being like, what the heck? Like, yeah. But I thought what was quite interesting is that is I mean, it was a very weird. If that was two Japanese people talking, I'd have probably got bored. But it was just such a weird situation. I actually found it quite interesting to watch. So I watched the whole like half an hour interview or whatever, even though I didn't really understand it. But you do pick up things like they would be like input the output the, or like I kept on hearing the word. They kept on saying like benkyo, and I was like, what does that mean? So I just googled it and was like, it means learn. I'm like, oh okay.
Okay.
You know, so like, even though I didn't understand anything, you just kind of go on and like some words jump out at you, and if they do jump out at you, then we're like, oh Google, what's that? You know? And even when I was hanging around with my Japanese friends last year, they'd like always say like words and things that like jump out at me, and then I'm just like when they're talking on my phone, if a word jumped out, I just Googled it and was like, oh, what does that mean? I'm like, oh, it means this, and then the next time I said it, I'll be like, oh yeah, I remember this. So I think there's like definitely a case to be made for that.
And I think as you've learned any second language, then your ability to listen for stuff that you don't understand just increases drastically anyway. And actually, I don't know if you've had this experience. It'd be interesting to hear what you think as a British person. So like, the Guy Ritchie's movies like Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels and Snatch, particularly those two, among others, have a bit of a reputation, at least in America, of being like quite hard to understand, and not like there's plot wise as well, but like the dialogue is like written in such a way that it's kind of hard to follow. Like they even have like they'll have little rhymes, and like in his newest one, The Gentleman, or it's a couple of years old now, there's even some like other languages in there where they like throw in some random French and stuff just to make it rhyme. And I always found those like I liked them, but I didn't really understand a lot of what was going on. And then when I spent like months just immersing in Swedish recently, and like no subtitles or anything, like, because that's actually only a recent change for me, like in the last year or so, I found that when I went back to anything speaking English at all, like even that stuff, I felt like it was literally at a slower pace. And I was like, this is so clear. I don't understand how anyone can not understand this. I
had a similar experience when I went, when I was first in Taiwan for a few months. I had, I spent most of my time hanging around with Taiwanese people, and I only really watched like Mandarin shows. I think I went like maybe 2-3 months basically without English. More, I mean, I spoke to my girlfriend and my family every now and again, but and then I think my girlfriend visited me around about December time for like the holidays, and then we watched a TV series in English, and I was just like, this is what it's like to understand everything. I forgot what this was like. But and it's just like so clear and easy and just.
Yeah, did it sound like? But even like things like I'm quite into movies, but some complicated movies I don't always understand what's going on in like every single scene. But like I just found that all English speaking movies seem to literally like have more explanation in each scene. And it was like that explanation was always there. It's just that I wasn't picking up that I should have been listening for it at like every single moment. But now when I watch stuff in English, it's like, yep, he says that there, and that's actually super important. But like, and it seems almost weird to me that anyone would ever consider that it should be given more than like half a line's explanation. Because I'm like, he says it right there. Like, yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes with some Asian shows, they have the thing where they like to over-explain stuff when they have a scene that happened about 5 minutes ago, and then they do a flashback to that scene. I'm like, it literally just happened. Why are you doing a flashback?
I have.
It's just, it was fun.
I have heard of that about. I heard that at least in anime, the rule of like show don't tell seems to not exist at all. That's
show you, tell you, show you again.
Yeah.
But in terms of the films, like the only one I've seen out of the one I mentioned, I think was Snatch, and I don't remember them saying anything that's hard to understand other than the pikey people, because they speak with a very strong accent. They're like, "I like dogs," and it's like, "What? Dogs? And it's like, what?"
Yeah.
Oh, dogs. Yeah, I like dogs. And, even the guys in the films don't understand. That's kind of part of the joke because Pikey's just try to like, I don't know, trying to confuse them or something, I guess, in the film.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
apart from them characters, I could understand everything, fine. Cause, even people that lived in the UK, like, there was a really popular show called Peaky Blinders that was set in Birmingham.
I know. Yeah.
Some of my like international friends really wanted to watch the show, and then they were there like, oh, this like Birmingham accent's really thick, and I was there like, I think it's really, because my granddad sounded so Brummie, like so Birmingham. That's where I'm from originally, and I was just like, to me that accent sounds so like weak. And then it's like, it's so thick. I was like, it's not.
Yeah.
It's really not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, Cillian Murphy, the main character, is like the actor who plays the main character. He's Irish, so he's got to be putting that accent on.
Yeah, just like Brad Pitt in Snatch, he's not actually a pikey. He's obviously.
Well, if you see him in the credits, he's got a dialect coach. It actually says Mr. Pitt's dialect coach.
Oh, cool. But it would be interesting to know all those work. But anyway, back on to
just having a chat now.
So I think you said you dropped French for a few months, 8 some months ago, to kind of focus fully on Swedish, and you said you were kind of doing both for a little while. Do you notice a big difference now you're kind of solely focusing on like Swedish? Because I think the benefit almost, I think that, because people often say like the obvious that, if you're 4 hours a day then you 2 hours a week, it's less time. But I think you learn over twice as quick when you focus on the one, because I think it's just the fact that, like, as well as all the time you actually spend, you don't have decision fatigue, you don't have to decide anything, and also like all these little times when your brain just goes to something or you just relax, it's going to default to the thing you're learning. You're going to start thinking about this, and I feel like there's just the inherent benefit of whenever you have some time or whatever, your brain always goes to this one thing. That just makes it so much like more important in your mind, and it just kind of makes the learning process a lot quicker, as well as the obvious that you inherently have more time.
Yeah, and there's also like lost time in like switching even. So like I can remember both Swedish and French conversations from the time that I was trying to learn both, like with italki tutors, where I would say something and go like, yeah, you can say that in French, right? Like that's a thing. And it's possibly like it was a real thing that you could say, but also but my mind like second guessed it, because I was like, no, that's how you say it in Swedish. I've just like given the French translation of the Swedish thing, but that's how you, and like that's actually not true. It was just my mind like throwing curveballs, going like, oh, you've messed that up, kind of thing.
Do you ever mix them up as well?
Like very occasionally in really weird and unpredictable ways, like because they don't sound at all similar. But like, I think there was like times I think I'd been exposed to the Swedish form of like, in his opinion, which there's a certain way of saying it that's a kind of a bit literary and not used in spoken heaps. But I'd been reading a book with it, and so I went to say in French, à mon avis, which is in my opinion, and said like à mon tycke, which is like in my, and then the Swedish word for opinion. So it's like really strange, like that makes no sense at all to do that. But yeah, not like properly. I never like properly like said like, the smorgasbord or something like two completely, just like really random things like that. But yeah, there's that. I'll just keep going about the learning one at the same time. There's also like, it's not actually like 2 hours, a straight 2 hours, like you say, like there's always what your brain is doing as well. But even if there wasn't that, it's not like 2 hours versus 4 hours, therefore twice as much. You've got to remember that, like, you're awake 16 hours a day. And so, like, in the time that you're not studying anything, like, yes, you are, like, consolidating some things subconsciously and whatever, but you're also kind of sliding backwards. Like, you're just naturally forgetting everything. That's just the way it goes. And so it's actually like 4 hours going up the hill and then only 12 hours to slide back. Whereas if you go like 2 hours going up the hill, you've got like 14 hours. 14 hours to slide back. So I know that's kind of a really mathematical explanation of a kind of fluid concept, but I feel like it really does have the benefit of like you said, it really does seem to add up to more than twice as much. I would even say like twice as much seems to work out to about 3 times as much.
So for example, if you had, oh god, I think it's just like snowing here. Bloody hell.
Oh wow.
I was distracted. I was like, wait, what?
But Birmingham is meant like a pretty cold place, isn't it?
Yeah. Just took me off guard, but I can't remember what I was saying now. But if you have 2 hours, so this is the thing with 2 hours again. So if you have 2 hours of study in, say, French, then you probably say the first half an hour of that's going to be reviewing and refreshing, and then the next hour and a half could be like, say, new stuff. Yeah. So you're getting an hour and a half of new stuff, whereas if you did it for 4 hours, you're actually getting 3.5 hours of new stuff. So exactly, it's if you look at it for that lens, that you're talking about what you're consolidating and learning new stuff as well, then the actual new stuff you're going to learn is going to be more than double. Yeah, exactly. So it makes sense from that perspective.
Yeah, and you can just dive deeper into it, and I rarely have 4 hours a day at this stage. I wish I did, but so if you've got like an hour a day, and I spend that whole time reading or watching a series in Swedish, that's going to make a difference. Whereas it's going to be hard if I spend like 5 minutes working out which language I'm going to study first, another 25 minutes reading, and then another half an hour reading in French. But the first 5 minutes of that is spent going like, what? Right. Yeah. French kind of thing. So I think it certainly works. And this is not to, this discussion's been had many times on my channel and on other people's, but you definitely can study more than one at a time. I didn't enjoy it. And I realized that I was just doing it because I kind of wanted to be a polyglot. And it actually, even if I did want to be a polyglot, it doesn't actually make any sense, because I think it'll be a faster road to just study one at a time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's most successful polyglots that you see online, they didn't even do it, parallel. They did it sequentially. So they, get one to a very high level, and then kind of, go into it a little bit to kind of maintain it, and then go to another one in a lot of depth, and they kind of do it like that. Yeah. And I think what you said about I think it's called decision fatigue. There's this famous story of Mark Zuckerberg wears the same grey t-shirt every day because he doesn't have to think about what to wear. He just gets up and puts his t-shirt on. So doing this sort of thing, reducing the amount of things that you have to look at and you have to decide, it just means you don't spend waste any time beating around the bush. You just get up and do it. Exactly. So I think SIPs with similar benefits. I tend to read at exactly the same time every day. I tend to plan at least a week, or I just know I'm getting up and I know how many pages I'm setting up to read before I do it. You just pick up the book where the bookmark is, read a bit, and then put it down again. There's no thinking. It's already all the other things that could get in the way. I would want to try and sort out beforehand, and it kind of seems to streamline the process a lot more. So I find that really helpful as well. Yeah. Cool. So I guess going on to some other topics. So that's a little bit about why you dropped French, and just kind of focus more on Swedish. But then I think also something that we have similar is that when I first started learning Cantonese, I didn't really know what I was doing, and you tend to see the first and most popular blogs like Fluent in 3 Months and I'll Teach You a Language and stuff like that. And I started speaking a lot from quite early on, and then later I found out about people like Steve Kaufman Matt versus Japan and like AJAT and things like that. And then I started to get more interested in input-based learning. So I guess we've actually probably both, experienced both sides of the coin. So I was wondering, I think a lot of people in both camps seem to, at least in the comment sections, and someone seem to put across the point that, no, this is the one best method and therefore everyone should do this. Whereas reality, there's actually, a lot of benefits and drawbacks to both sides.
Exactly.
So I was wondering what your opinion was on the differences between the two. Yeah,
well, I think what I kind of tried to talk to Matt about, but I wasn't really clear on my thoughts myself, was the idea that it's like, okay, let's just assume that like an input heavy approach is by far the best way, and that's like a proven fact. If we take that, but I was kind of trying to ask him, but what about the idea that like it's actually very hard to convert people to that, so that might not be the best approach to use. How do you sell it? Yeah. Yes, yeah. And I kind of asked it wrong. So he was like, yeah, well, like, of course it's harder to sell. But I more meant like, is there room to open up a conversation about like starting people off on this idea of like, yeah, you can have a basic conversation after like an hour or two. And then, because you can, and then going like, oh, what we actually want to move towards is like a heavier input approach. Because I think even though like, yes, you do have to undo some errors that you might you might put into your own brain through your own speaking and stuff. I think that that's a more likely approach for most people. And it's also worth saying that there's actually like three different things out there, and the total like muggles, like people who are not into language learning at all, like English speaking monolinguals, the first thing you have to convince them of is that something other than what they heard at school is the way. So like they think that to learn a language, so you like sit down with a grammar book and learn vocabulary and learn grammar, and then just like buy Rosetta Stone or something. Yeah, or yeah, maybe that. Yeah, probably that. Or like, because I've heard that a few times. It's like, oh, do you just buy Rosetta Stone? I was like, at the time, I was like, wait, what's Rosetta Stone? Yeah, yeah, but yeah. I told this guy that I was learning Swedish, and he's like, oh, so like, how are you doing that? Do you have a book? And it's like, a book? What? That never even occurred to me. Like, how would you learn a foreign language from a book? I mean, okay, maybe if it had like a CD. I was going to say, yeah, I'm a big fan of textbooks, but always with audio. Yeah. So like, but I have seen those books are generally for more advanced learners where they're like, oh, this is like the French subjunctive or something. But yeah, so like, I think there's like the full on traditional school approach where it's like, this is a verb and this is how we conjugate the first verb of the second tense and all this stuff. And then there's like probably the one that's most commonly found online is your kind of Benny Lewis speak from day one approach, and then there's like input. So I think there's almost like three different things. So and for languages that resemble your own, I think that speaking from an early stage works pretty okay. Like, I still don't think it's perfect. It probably won't get you to as advanced a level as we would like to get to, but it works fine. And like, it worked for me, and maybe it wasn't the fastest way to do it. It wasn't the best way, and I'm still kind of undoing some pronunciation things and stuff, but like, it works okay. So I don't think it's like a what's the word? I don't think it's I don't think it's a question that we need to like go to war over, kind of thing. I also think taking into account human psychology is very important, because like you're saying, it's how do you get people to do it? And from a pure efficiency point of view, it is interesting to talk about that. But at the end of the day, if I remember when I had my first hour-long conversation in Cantonese without English with my tutor, it was terrible. I made a lot of mistakes, but
I was so happy the entire. I was just sitting at. I remember I was sitting in the porter cabin at work in the afternoon. The lesson was at like 7 a.m. and then finished at 8. I was still like 3 p.m. I was there like smiling to myself. I was still on like this high, and I don't, like thinking I said something. This person understood and they actually communicated with a real life person. Gives you a lot more motivation than watching things you don't understand in your bedroom.
Exactly. Yeah.
That tangible sense of progress early on is very important, and I think if you are to try and sell people on the input-based approach, it's kind of like trying to train yourself to kind of notice things and be accepting and like pat yourself on the back for the things that you did. I remember my first time I watched a TV show in Cantonese, and I think there was like an entire scene, and the only word I understood in the entire scene was the word for sorry, and I was there like, hey, cool, I understood what he said. You don't have to like necessarily be like, oh, I don't understand all of this.
Yeah. I remember like I actually remember telling an early italki partner, because I didn't even start paying for tutors until like 2 years in or something. No, a year in. So I remember telling an italki partner that like a big victory for me about 5 weeks into learning Swedish was when I was watching this Danish series, just like by not to immerse or anything, just because I was watching it, and there was one character who was Swedish, and like obviously like the subtitles are just in English either way. They don't say like this guy's speaking Swedish. They just have the subtitles. And my first ever victory in Swedish was like, he's Swedish, like that. Which is such a small thing. Like I could probably train you to hear the difference in like probably 20 minutes. But if that's not something you've actively worked on, it's still something that doesn't come naturally to English speakers. So yeah, there is that. And like, I think as like, if you have lots of conversations like I did, like I spoke Swedish like twice a week for over a year. I think I did start noticing like at around the 8-9 month mark, like the level just plateauing big time. And my thinking at that time was like, how do you get like, how does anyone ever reach the top of the mountain at this rate? Because like the first 9 months were really fast, but now I'm just having the same conversations over and over again. So yeah, but it still took me probably another 2 years to realize the benefits of heavy input.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think like people might listen to that story and think, well, he could tell it was Swedish. So well, obviously he could tell, you listen to French or German, it's French or German, and being like someone who grew up in Europe or whatever. But it reminded me of a story when I was first learning Cantonese. I watched a movie called Shaolin Soccer by a director called Stephen Chow, and it's really over-the-top kung fu sort of films about these guys who use kung fu to play football and then enter this tournament and end up doing really well. It's a really, really hilarious film, really funny. But one of the, and like 99% of people in the movie are speaking Cantonese, but there's this one girl from mainland China who speaks Mandarin in the movie. And the first time I watched it was a few months into learning Cantonese, and I watched the whole thing with English subtitles. And then I watched the movie again a few months ago, like after I'd been in Taiwan, I'd learnt Mandarin and stuff. And I didn't, the first time I watched the film, I didn't even realize she was speaking Mandarin. And then I watched it and I was like, wait, what? Was she speaking Mandarin the first time as well? And I just didn't notice. Yeah. But because everything was so like incomprehensible at the time, I just didn't know the differences and stuff. I was just like, I was like, oh, well, I can't understand because my Cantonese is bad. And it didn't even occur to me that it might be a different language altogether.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I should say that in the Swedish-Danish thing, these are like a Swedish and a Danish person talking to each other. So, that difference is actually not obvious to anyone who doesn't speak one of the.
And it was the same in the movie. Like one person speak Cantonese that way, and they speak Mandarin back, which is common in some parts of. I think that actually did happen in Hong Kong and stuff, when people just speak what's comfortable to them.
Yeah, and if the other person can understand it, but yeah, so that, like, getting back to your question about input, because I tend to go on these tangents, it's like, I think just like, I didn't even really know about, like I knew who Steve Kaufman was from probably probably about a year in, maybe a little bit after I started studying French. So that was just after the 1 year mark. And I had seen a couple of Matt's videos around and never clicked on them, because I think in those days his thumbnails were like very Japanese heavy. So I'd always just kind of assumed that they were about learning Japanese. And like often they are, but he's got some like really good, and like his videos that did really well, like why you still can't understand your target language. I think it was like I watched that and I was like, oh, so that's who this guy is. But even in that video, he's like fairly humble, and it's like not like he ever says like my Japanese is really good. He just says like some people's out there is really bad and no one can tell because they don't speak Japanese. And yeah, it was once I started getting the idea of like what he was on about with input and stuff, I was still like, nah, I like my method. And then I think it was, I don't know, I wouldn't really say that I ever kind of went, oh no, that's it, input is the way to go. But I think I started kind of turning on that decision a little bit when I saw his interview with Steve and saw how good his like off the cuff Japanese was. I was like, okay, so you really can do that. Like, because I always just thought, nah, like I feel like you have to speak. And like Steve says, you have to speak. It's not like anyone saying you never have to speak it. But
I think even Matt says you have to like practice speaking now.
Yeah.
But it's just a case of you got to build up your potential first. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah. So now it makes a whole lot more sense. Like I've been fiddling around with a third language. Well, I wouldn't ever really call it a third language, because I've been fiddling around with Croatian on drops, which is like not drops is like kind of hilarious in like it teaches you the word for like cheese grater and stuff, just totally out of context. But like
kind of like the Duolingo thing when they just teach you the word for penguin before you know the word for like therefore or because.
Yeah, but I think what like this is just my little rant about Duolingo. Like I think what annoys me about Duolingo is that it seems that they think that it works, and they are always encouraging you to do more, and they're like, you know, there's the famous meme of like the Duolingo owl that'll like come to your house and kidnap your family or whatever. But like, it's because they're always saying like, do more Duolingo. And it's like, they're pushing this idea that if you do enough of it, you will become fluent in the language. And that's just not true. Whereas I think that drops are kind of like, look, this is just a way to learn some words. You're not going to learn the language. You're just learning words. And so I've been doing that in Croatian because I feel at this point there's like no risk of it becoming like overtaking my obsession with Swedish. Because
just a little bit of dabbling.
Yeah. And like one day it might, but hopefully by then I will be ready for it too. And then I'll start doing something proper in Croatian. But like,
no, I've done that before. Just downloaded an Anki deck for the hiragana just because I was like, well, I'll just learn a little bit, and then I was start to think how much effort it's going to take, and then get put off by the idea and go, I'm just going to go back to Chinese again. Yeah,
okay. Well, that's I would call that like a positive feedback loop, where you actually like if you don't want to, if you're trying not, I actually deliberately try to stay away from some things because I'm like, well, that would just be distracting at this point.
Yeah, no, I mean same, but then sometimes when you dabble into, because sometimes you get a bit of like a craving or like an itch to go study a different language, and you'll be like, okay, I'll go and dabble into it. And then, you know, because you keep telling yourself, oh, you know, you always know this and this and this is going to be so easy. And then I was actually starting to think to myself, actually, to get to a good level, it's going to take a lot of time. And then I was like, actually, I can't be bothered, so let's just stick with Mandarin for now.
Yeah.
Kind of brain it back in.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an interesting conversation. Just to go back to what you're talking about, I mean, I don't want to like plug Matt's channel. But
oh man, I've been accused of doing that on my channel.
I mean, he's a nice guy. Yeah, I mean, we're friends, so I guess it's okay. But I mean, like when I was in Taiwan, a lot of my course mates were Japanese, and I gave one of my best friends at the time in my class, a girl called Kasumi. I think I showed her one of Matt's videos, and she was like so surprised. She almost like fell off her chair when she heard him speak. And, you know, I was just like, okay, no, he's like very good. And there's the hesitance on the internet to kind of like blow your own trumpet just purely because you're going to get people commenting, and you're in the public eye, people going, oh yeah, obviously he's not perfect and there's things that he does get wrong, and then people are going to find that and like criticize you and hammer you for it, whereas if you're humble and go, well, I'm just doing my own thing, then people tend to be a lot more nice to you about it. So I understand the hesitance to go about all that, but
oh man, I could never do it, because even like I made a video in Swedish about how annoying Swedes were. And one of the, like, I was just kind of joking, but one of the things was that like how some of them online say like, oh, your Swedish is far from perfect. It's like, dude, I have never said it was perfect. I don't know where you're like, and like even on that video, there was this guy who's like, oh, well, you can hear that some of your vowels are off and stuff. It's like, yeah, like I said in the video that it's not perfect. What more do you want? So I could never, I would love to be able to snap my fingers to get it to a stage where it actually is perfect, and like then do a video where it's like, it is perfect, so shut up. Yeah.
Just one of those videos like clueless white guy speaks perfect Swedish or something.
yeah. Clueless, a different shade of white guy.
Interesting. There was something I wanted to say a bit. I kind of went off on a few tangents when you talked about grammar and the idea of like traditional textbook studying and how it's, you're learning at the start and it's very hard to get your mind around all these like abstract rules. I always find like, when you're trying to learn any new skill, that when you're first starting and you have no like experience with this thing or you have no context for it, it's very hard to understand things. So it's going to give a silly example. So I'm playing this game with my family online called The Settlers of Catan, or like Catan Universe or something, which is just like this board game you play online, which is a lot of fun. Some of the rules can be quite complicated. And my dad went to watch just like half an hour video explaining all the rules to one of these expansion packs. And he's just there like, I don't understand anything he's saying. But then, you go in, play a few games, get a lot of context to what they're saying, go back and watch the same video and it's going to make a lot more sense. So in the same respect, I think grammar is the same thing. Whereas if you learn it at the beginning with no reference points for any of it, of course you're not going to really understand the fine points of how to use the subjunctive in French. But if you kind of get a lot of input or you speak a lot or whatever, you kind of be like, oh, I think that sounds kind of familiar because I think I've heard it used in this context before. And you kind of have like a reference point in your brain, which for me helps an absolutely massive amount when trying to like learn all these explanations. But the other thing I'd also say is that a lot of these books use way too much jargon, and even, when I was in Taiwan, what they used to do is they used to give us like heaps and heaps of example sentences and just show us how they're used in different contexts. And for me, that was way, way more useful. Yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think jargon is really unhelpful because, like, I consider myself a little bit of an English nerd. Like, as in, there are quite a few things in English where I'm like, technically it should actually be that way around because you're not saying that, whatever. But even like it took me to learn a second language before I learned like what things like the subjunctive were. So to give you an example, I didn't actually know that English had a subjunctive, which is that like if I were to say to you, blah, 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 I just always knew that if I'm saying if I and I can say were, then even though it's obviously in the normal past tense, it's if I was. And it took me to learn French before like a really, really fluent in English French teacher said like, well, it's like in English when you say if I were. And I was like, oh, yeah, like we actually we do have that tense in English. But in French, they have like a different one for every verb, whereas we only have one for the verb to be. So, yeah, I think jargon is really unhelpful because most people don't even know like what anything beyond like a noun or a verb or an adjective. Like they know noun, verb, and adjective, but they don't know like adverb or preposition or at least in Australia, which is probably one of the lower educated countries when it comes to the English language. I think you've I think you've got to get a bit of a combination. Like you've got to get a bit of input, and then maybe if this is assuming that you want a reasonably fast understanding of grammar, a little bit of input, a little bit of speaking, maybe a little bit of explanation, then more input, and then like maybe a re-explanation of the explanation you've already heard, kind of thing. Like, I don't think there's really any way to force it, and I think that most people just need to relax in terms of like not understanding stuff. I think that's probably the big thing that most people who come to language learning having never learned a language before. The one big like it's kind of like learning anything else, but one big difference is that there's so much to a language that you're never going to learn it in any kind of logical order. Like you're never going to learn like in photography, you know, you're going to learn like basic exposure. You're going to learn the factors that control exposure. Then you might learn about focus, and then you might start on more complicated things like framing and like leading lines and direction of light and stuff like that. And that's like a logical order to follow. But like language learning is like that, but a language is like that times 20. So there's no like you're going to come across something that you don't understand, and you've just got to keep going.
It's going to happen a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And it's probably going to keep happening. Like it happens less and less frequently. But it gets to the point eventually that when you come across things that like don't make sense with your own understanding of the language, that's actually so rare that it kind of that you go like, what is this? Like, why has this not come up before? But like it does happen, but it takes quite a long time. So yeah, I think people just need to learn to relax and not try and learn it like it's a degree or something.
Yeah, I think one of the things that hold people back most in languages, I guess I'd say two things. One would be the fear of getting out there and using actual content, but I think they're related. The other thing is like that kind of perfectionist thing that's like, no, I can't listen to that because I won't understand a lot of it, or you know, I'm going through this book and I need to look up every single word that I don't know, otherwise how can I say I've read it? You know, I'm reading a book now and there'll be a few words come up that I don't know and be like, yeah, well, whatever, it's like I can tell based on the context that it's roughly this, or you know, it's not really that important, or you know, whatever, and you know, focus on just enjoying the content and kind of doing what you need to do to understand that, as opposed to just I need to look up everything, because then, you know, it just slows you down so much.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth saying that never goes away, that feeling that like you somehow owe it to the book or the movie or whatever. Like there were certain Swedish things that I was avoiding for a long time. Because I was like, no, I want my Swedish to be at a really good level before I watch that thing, because I felt like it would be like a bit like watching a really good movie on like your phone or something. As in, I was like, no, like I want to save. I want to like save it for the big screen. The big screen being like when I understand Swedish perfectly. But like, it's actually a really enjoyable experience to not understand something, but to still understand quite a lot of it, and then the benefit. To rewatch the
same film later down the line.
Exactly, you can go back. Like, yeah, I'm really looking forward to quite a few Swedish things that I've already seen. But like last time I watched them, I had to watch them with subtitles, like 3 years ago or something.
Yeah, and then sometimes when you do realize like stuff that you missed the first time, it's actually quite entertaining.
Absolutely. Yeah, and stuff that you're like, oh, the subtitles definitely wouldn't have put that in there, or like wouldn't have got that, or yeah, either you missed it or you know that like the English translation, the English subtitles wouldn't have got it because it was like too many words or something.
Yeah, I think that because I like suffered with this, and normally I think I'm quite good. At least I tell myself that I'm quite good at jumping into like the deep end a lot of the time and kind of immersing myself in stuff that I know I wouldn't be as comfortable understanding. But then until quite recently, only like really a few months ago, I hadn't really watched any like historical dramas in Chinese, and I was kind of like, well, no, they're too difficult for me now. I need to learn more about it, and then whatever before I start watching it, because they kind of speak this weird mix of like modern and classical Chinese sometimes when they're speaking. And I'm just like, well, you know, kind of like how in like certain films or whatever, like Lord of the Rings or whatever, they'd say like things with a slight like flavor of olden English, but it's not actually olden English. You just have to get used to like these few little changes, then you can understand it quite quickly.
Yeah.
But so I kind of put it off for a long time, and then I was like, oh, you know what? I'm just going to watch a TV drama. In the first episode, I found it really hard to follow. It was like 80 episodes. By the time I watched the last one, I was a lot more comfortable than for episode 1.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's quite interesting. What else did I have? Oh yeah, so I think you said before you were speaking to your kids and trying to raise them to learn Swedish. I was just wondering if you could speak about that. Like, are you also like doing things like putting on Swedish cartoons or anything like that?
Yeah. So there's a little bit of a culture, at least in Australia, probably in quite a lot of the world. I think a lot of the English-speaking world of like, I'd love to be able to raise my kids bilingual, because I think a lot of us are quite annoyed that that was never an opportunity for us. And so people try to do it, but like my brother, for example, has tried to do it with his kids in German, but his German is like nowhere near good enough that he can just say most things that he needs to say in German. Like it's like probably a fifth as good as my Swedish. And even I find like there's certain things I struggle to know how to say or to how they would say it. So I don't think that works for a lot of people who try it, because they're not actually fluent in a second language. But I think even people who are from like their country, like say from the mothers from Venezuela or something, I think one error that they make, or at least we'll see if I'm going to be right about this, is that they just expected their own input for their own speaking to the child will do the trick. But I think like a lot of, obviously there's a discussion to be had about screen time, like how much screen time kids should get, and like ideally we should limit it and stuff. But like
that's a lot of conversation.
Yeah, like a lot of what kids learn, I think, is from TV, like or that kind of thing, TV and screens and whatever. So what I've tried to do, I mean, he's super young. This is only my younger son. My older son's a bit like too far gone now. He's almost 10. And he's like, not too far gone to learn a language, obviously, but too far gone to like try and raise him in that language. But he's the older one is interested a little bit in, he's actually just randomly started trying to learn Japanese. I don't really know why. But whatever. I encourage him to learn whatever he can. But with my younger one, he occasionally we watch the cartoon Bing, which I believe is a British cartoon. I'm
not sure. I don't know.
So it's like it'd be weird if you did, because it's for like really little kids. It's like a very the sort of toddler shows. And we've watched about like probably an average of one a day of those. They're like 7-minute episodes. On the Swedish government content website kind of thing. It's actually, for anyone listening to this, if it exists in your target language, depending on your level, it's a really, really good show for language learning, because it's basically teaching toddlers how things work. Not like necessarily mechanical things, but like life concepts. So like, this little rabbit, he'll have a crisis or whatever. He'll be doing something, he'll be enjoying something, and then something will go wrong, and then it'll be fixed. And then he actually runs on screen at the end and explains the whole story in his own words. And this whole thing's in 7 minutes. So it's like a 7-minute definition of different things, like flying a kite or slippery dips or whatever. So I've actually found it really beneficial as well, because I don't know the word for slippery dip. without, like, that's not something I'm going to come across in my immersion, like reading crime novels and stuff. So that's the sort of stuff that I'm more likely to speak to my son about. So I've been really enjoying watching that with him. And yeah, I hope that we can just keep going with basically all screen time for like the first good like 6 years of his life to be in Swedish, because otherwise I think that he will quickly realize that it's like a chore to speak Swedish, because it's like his mum speaks to him in English, his brother speaks to him in English. He's going to be better at English. It's inevitable. So that's my theory, is that if I can keep something he really enjoys in Swedish for as long as possible, then he might at least associate those two things and hopefully keep speaking to me in Swedish, hopefully.
I think something that I've learned from, because I had some friends here that were, you know, born in England, but they were like British-born Chinese, so both their parents had tried to speak to them or raise them in either Cantonese or Mandarin. I think the problem that a lot of, well, it's not a problem, I guess it's just normal, but I think that a lot of happens to a lot of children is when they go to school and they, you know, with all their peers, they want to sound like their peers, so that there's a strong urge for them to want to fit in and be like the people around them and just speak English. So then when they go back to their homes, a lot of them want to like say, even if they can understand, and that, you know, it's quite common that their parents will speak to them in like Chinese or whatever, and then they'd reply back in English.
Yeah. And
apparently that's quite a common thing, because they just, you know, want to be like the friends around them. And then later when they get to an older age, they're like, damn, why didn't I speak to my parents more in Chinese?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've heard that, seen that a few times.
Yeah. But I mean, like sort of continuing the whole input thing, like, learning to understand it is like probably more than half the job. So if they probably do feel like, I'm guessing they have that feeling of when they try to speak Chinese that they're like, this is really hard, and they don't like doing things that are hard because we're not used to it as adults. But if you could,
but it's a hell of a lot better than starting from zero. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, especially with a language like Chinese, or like a language so far removed from English. Like, yeah, I had a friend whose mum always spoke to him in Spanish, and he wouldn't call himself a Spanish speaker, but he could read Spanish novels and stuff, which is like, so he would really just need to learn to output, basically. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when you learn to say what you already understand, it's a lot easier. Exactly,
yeah. Yeah, so that's the theory. I'm kind of, I really don't know how it's going to go, because obviously I don't want to like force him into things that he doesn't like from a really early age. But I'm kind of keen to get it to work, because I really like the idea of I imagine this conversation that he'll have to have when he's like 15 and like meets Swedish people and stuff, and they're like, "Why do you speak Swedish?" And he'll be like, "Oh, my dad spoke to me in it." And then they're like, "Was your dad Swedish?" No, he wasn't.
That'd be quite an interesting story.
Yeah.
The Lamont class for Swedish.
Like, I've like invent my own dialect that only 2 people speak.
Yeah, well, it's a legit dialect.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that was really interesting. I think the interview's already getting quite long, so what we'll do, I think we're planning on doing another one for Lamont's channel, which I'll leave a link for in the description, along with his Instagram as well. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to say before we wrap this up, or...
No, that's cool. I really liked your questions, and yeah, thanks for having me on.
It was a lot of fun. So
cool.
And if anyone wants to see, I guess, part 2 or the other half of what we're going to record, then it'll be on Lamont's channel. So I'll put everything in the description, and I'll see you guys next time.
Yeah.